Good evening. Welcome to another virtual evening here at the Oxford Union. My name is James Price. I'm the president for this term. And in just a minute, we'll be in conversation with Professor Stephen Pinker, who has a presentation for us. Without further ado, we're going to now turn to Professor Pinker, who's going to give us a presentation.
Thank you. My title, Progress and Enlightenment in the 21st Century, immediately raises the question, what do I mean by progress? Could you possibly get people to agree on what the concept of progress even is? I don't think it's that hard to define progress. I define it as improvements in human flourishing, where human flourishing would comprise dimensions such as life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness. If they have increased over time, I submit that would be progress. Well, let's go to the data. Beginning with the most precious thing of all, life itself. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth was pinned at around 30 years of age. But then, beginning in the 19th century, with advances in sanitation, antibiotics, vaccinations, life expectancy began to increase to the point where today it is 71 years worldwide, close to more than 80 years in more fortunate, affluent countries in Europe and the Americas, but every region of the world, including sub-Saharan Africa, has shown spectacular gains. Sustenance. Famine was one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and in any part of the world was just one bad harvest away. But thanks to advances in agronomy, famines no longer are a matter of an inability to grow sufficient calories and protein, but a question of getting it to remote and war-torn parts of the world. Prosperity. There is no answer to the question, why is there poverty? Poverty is the natural state of humanity. The question that we ought to ask is, why is there wealth? And for most of human history, there was little to no growth from the background level of prosperity to begin with. For about 1,600 years, economic growth was less than 1 pixel high. Then with the Industrial Revolution, it has shot up to about 200 times what it was in the early 18th century. Now, this would be a dubious form of progress if all of those gains in prosperity went to the proverbial 1%. But in fact, they have decimated the rate of extreme poverty. By today's definition of extreme poverty, about 90% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty 200 years ago. That has fallen to less than 9%. Now, within developed countries, of course, many, if not most of the gains have gone to the more affluent, but it does not mean that developed countries have become increasingly indifferent to the plight of the needy. Quite the contrary. Whereas 150 years ago, developed countries devoted only about 1.5% of their GDP to redistribution, that is to social spending, to the poor, to children, to the sick, to the elderly. In the 20th century, every developed country went on a binge of redistribution or social spending, so that there is still a range from relatively stingy countries like the United States to more munificent ones like France, but an average OECD country reallocates about 22% of its GDP to social spending. Peace. For most of human history, the natural state of relations between big empires and kingdoms was war. And peace was merely a brief interlude between wars. But then after the most destructive war in history, World War II, that began to change. And from a rate of about 20 battle deaths per 100,000 people per year in 1946, the rate has fallen quite unevenly to less than 1% today. It's been something of a roller coaster with peaks for the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iran-Iraq War, and the Syrian Civil War, but the overall trajectory is unmistakably downward. Freedom and rights. We have read with alarm about the threats and erosion to democracy in many countries, not least my own adopted country of the United States. But still, if you add up all of the countries and not just focus on the most flagrant backsliders, and you give them a score from -10 for an autocracy to +10 for the best possible democracy, you see that the world has never been more democratic than it has been in the last decade or so. Unless this seems impossible to believe, I can just think back to when I was an undergraduate student, and half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain, living under totalitarian communist dictatorships. Spain and Portugal were literally fascist dictatorships. Most of Latin America was under the control of military juntas. In East Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Philippines, all of them controlled by military or right-wing governments, all of them democratic today. And we don't read as much about the countries here and there who have made progress toward democracy, but overall the trajectory has been upward. Violent crime. In any part of the world that lives in a state of anarchy, there will be high rates of predation and vendetta and blood feuds. In medieval Europe, the homicide rate was about 35 per 100,000 per year, and homicide statistics go back centuries because people have always been interested in killings, and corpses are a pretty objective measure of that kind of violent crime. Then in every European country, rates of homicide fell so that they are about 1% today. And that process tends to be replicated whenever central governments establish control over frontier and anarchic regions, and the code of vendetta is replaced by a court system and the rule of law. Happened again in colonial New England, happened still later in the American Wild West, and even parts of the world that remain violent today, such as Mexico, were far more violent a century ago. Not just homicide, but other forms of violent crime have been in decline. These are data from the United States on two forms of violence against women, namely sexual assault and domestic violence against wives and girlfriends. They've come down considerably since data started being recorded in the 70s. Knowledge. The natural state of humanity is ignorance and illiteracy. And for most of human history, literacy was a privilege of a small aristocratic and clerical minority. About 15% of Europe was literate 500 years ago. Then every European country achieved 100% literacy by the 20th century. The United States as well. And then that has been spreading to the rest of the world, such as Latin America. And the world as a whole today is about 80% literate, 90% for people under the age of 25. Well, does any of this improve the quality of our lives? These are the kinds of data that economists enjoy measuring, but how does it affect us in our daily lives? Well, there have been tremendous progress in that sphere as well. For example, 150 years ago, the typical work week in the United States and Europe was more than 60 hours per week. Today, it is less than 40, and most workers receive several weeks of paid vacation, which would have been inconceivable in Dickensian times. And thanks to the universal penetration of running water and electricity, and the widespread adoption of labor-saving devices like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of our lives that we waste on housework has declined from about 60 hours a week to fewer than 15 hours a week. As a result, at least in the United States, I'm sure it's the same in Britain, the amount of leisure time that we have has increased over the last 50 years, both for men and for women. For women, you can't help but notice the flattening of that progress beginning in the 1980s. And the reason is that women today spend more time with their children. Actually, both sexes do. A single working woman today spends more time with her children than a married stay-at-home mom did in the 1950s, contrary to our stereotypes. Well, does any of this make us any happier? Because that would be the ultimate measure of progress. And the answer is we certainly would expect it to, because there is a strong relationship between life satisfaction and income measured as GDP per capita. It is, of course, a logarithmic relationship. This is plotted on log coordinates because an extra £1,000 makes a poor person much happier than a rich person, but nonetheless, it occurs throughout the scale, both across countries, each country represented by a dot, and within countries, the scatter represented by an arrow impaling the dot. Since the world has gotten richer, all parts of the world, we would expect that its people to get happier. And in about 70% of countries for which we have data, that is true. Interestingly, the United States is not one of them, but the United States started off as a relatively happy country to begin with. And contrary to a widespread misconception that despite all of our affluence and luxuries and banishment of early death, that suicide rates are spiking, nothing could be further from the truth. Worldwide, suicide rates have declined by about 40% over the last 3 decades, and that is true in a majority of countries. Well, this all raises some questions about progress, such as what caused it? In the 19th century, there was a vaguely mystical notion that nature contained some dialectic toward progress that lifts us ever upward, but that is quite opposite to the way the universe works. The universe has no particular concern for our well-being and often seems to be trying to grind us down. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I argue that the ideals of the Enlightenment were responsible for progress, namely reason, science, and humanism. That is, when we apply our ingenuity to the goal of making people better off, every now and again we succeed. If we remember what works, discard the failures, then increment by increment, we can make ourselves better off. Nothing mystical about it. Lest this seems so obvious that it doesn't deserve a name, let alone a book, there are alternatives to reason, science, and humanism. For example, the idea that our purpose in life comes from religious scripture, the doctrines of authoritarian nationalism and populism, reactionary ideologies that say we've got to get back to a golden age rather than striving toward improvement, and revolutionary ideologies that say that we have to dismantle the system in the hope that anything that rises out of the rubble is bound to be better than what we have. Second question, even if there has been progress, aren't we better off kind of denying it or pretending it isn't there to safeguard against a slide into complacency? And I don't think so. I think we're best off with an understanding of the world that is accurate. This is not a brief for optimism, it's a brief for accuracy. Of course, we must be aware of danger, suffering, and injustice wherever they occur. But we also have to be aware of how they can be reduced, because counteracting the danger of complacency, there are dangers to thoughtless pessimism. Among them are fatalism. If, despite all of our efforts, life just gets worse and worse, why even bother? Why throw good money after a hopeless cause? And the threat of radicalism, to calls to smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground, if you believe that all of our institutions are failing and beyond all hope for reform. Third question, is progress inevitable? And the answer is, of course not. Progress does not mean that everything gets better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That would not be progress. That would be a miracle. And progress is not a miracle. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems. Problems are inevitable, as your colleague David Deutsch emphasized in his book, The Beginning of Infinity, and solutions create new problems that have to be solved in their turn. This brings me to a topic that I could not possibly avoid in a talk about progress, namely the pandemic that we have been living through for the past 10 months. How do we understand a pandemic in a world of progress? And the starting point is to remember that infectious disease is the rule in life, not the exception. as pathogens and parasites are universal. You and I are big, yummy mounds of gingerbread there for the eating as far as a germ is concerned. As Augustus de Morgan said, great fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum. And the world has been racked by pandemics far worse than the one we've been living through, the plague of Justinian, which killed about half of Europe, the Black Death, 10 to 60% of Europe. The colonization of the Americas led to the loss of 90% of the indigenous population. There were pandemics in China and India. The smallpox pandemic killed 300 million people in the 20th century alone. The so-called Spanish flu a century ago killed 50 million. HIV/AIDS has killed 32 million so far. Now, pandemics unquestionably set back progress, at least for a while. For example, here is a graph of life expectancy in a number of European countries over the 20th century. When I first saw this graph, you can't help but notice this dip, and my conclusion initially was, oh my God, that is the horrible human cost of war, of World War I, until I looked at the years and discovered that that's not the death toll from World War I, that's the death toll from the Spanish flu. But you will also notice that the life expectancy improved after the pandemic had run its course. Also true of the terrible tragedy of HIV/AIDS in Africa, which set back life expectancy, but since then has rebounded, and we can hope for that that will happen with COVID-19 as well. Our traditional defenses against infectious disease, the reason that despite the universality of pathogens and parasites, we're not all dead, our species do not go extinct, is that we have an immune system, we have sexual reproduction, which makes our children genetically different from ourselves, so that any pathogen that has cracked our internal locks has to start all over again when it comes to our kids. The emotion of disgust, a primitive defense against disease vectors, and sadly, xenophobia. Modern defenses are reason, science, and humanism. These forces of progress had already begun to reduce the death toll from the 5 most lethal infectious diseases that strike children: pneumonia, diarrhea, measles, malaria, and HIV/AIDS. And we are beginning to see the progress made against COVID-19, that the pathogen was identified in days, the sequenced genome within a week, the first vaccine tested in 4 months, and 2 shown to be effective within 9 months, deployed on a large scale within 10 months. That is an astonishing accomplishment in human progress. As this graph from Marianne Tooby showed, when it came to other vaccines, anywhere between 3,000 years and 5 years had to elapse before vaccines were deployed. In the case of COVID-19, it was less than 4 months. So let me just wrap up with some conclusions about progress. Progress is a real phenomenon. It is not a matter of optimism, of seeing the glass as half full, of wearing rose-colored glasses. It's there in the data when you look at it. The data show that our lives are longer, healthier, richer, safer, smarter, freer, fairer, and more equal than ever before. Terrible problems remain, undoubtedly. Progress is not the same as perfection. The existence of problems today, however, does not mean that there has been no progress, because most often the problems of yesterday were worse. As Franklin Pierce Adams said, nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. Progress is an unnatural state of affairs. It does not happen by itself. It is the result of applying knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Progress can continue if we remain committed to reason, science, and humanism. And if we don't, it may not. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Pinker. While you get yourself sat back down again, I'll just remind everybody who's watching this that please do submit your questions into the Q&A function just at the bottom of the Zoom chat, and I'll be asking them to Professor Pinker in just a second. I'm also aware of my own foibles at knowing that I'm such an optimist myself, that seeing all of that, it accorded exactly with all of my biases, and I'll try and be a bit more critical in some of the questions that are coming along. I suppose the first question, therefore, would be wondering, with all of these graphs moving in the right direction, with what is, you say it's not a miracle, but it certainly looks like a miracle and sounds like a miracle in some ways, just at first glance, why is it that so many people are so damn miserable all the time and so negative about everything? What is it that in the brain or in society that makes us not feel the wonderful momentum and trajectory that we're all on?
Yes, well, so, of course, since progress is not a blanket phenomenon that makes everyone happier at the same time, there are people who are genuinely worse off. But in addition, those of us, much of the gloom that we feel, in addition to what is actually merited when things do get worse, such as a pandemic or such as countries that have suffered from authoritarian populism, such as my adopted country, at least until tomorrow. But even when things go better, people often think they go worse. And it is a combination of a feature of our own psychology called the negativity bias. We feel losses more than we appreciate gains. We tend to forget the negative affect of bad events through. But it does combine with the nature of journalism, because journalism is about things that happen, not things that don't happen. And a lot of good things are things that don't happen. A country that's not at war, that doesn't get attacked by terrorists or a rampage shooter, that is not suffering a pandemic. And those aren't news. And when progress does happen, it tends to be, it tends to creep up. It's not built in a day. As one of your colleagues at Oxford, Max Roser, has put it, the papers could have had the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never had that headline because it didn't happen on a particular Thursday in October. And so 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty and no one knows about it. And that it feeds into our psychology, the very nature of journalism, thanks to the what Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky dubbed the availability heuristic. Namely, we judge risk and danger and frequency by how readily we can recall anecdotes and images and narratives from memory. And so if you have memory and impressions fed by gory images, that's going to lead to the impression that they are plentiful. All of the boring countries at peace, kids who go to school and who are well-fed and healthy, just don't register in our mental tabulator of events in the world.
Do you get this that negativity bias yourself? Do you notice it happening in your own brain, or are these sorts of graphs so seared into the way you think about and look at the world that you manage to escape the trap of those availability and negative biases?
I try to calibrate my intuitions with data, because I consume headlines just like everyone else, and I'm a regular visitor to the absolutely stupendous website that run out of your own institution, Max Roser's Our World in Data, which is it gives you a very different view of the world than the daily headlines, including a data-driven understanding of what is going wrong. It's not by no means a happy news site. It has probably the best graphical interface for understanding the COVID pandemic, updated daily, and allowing the crucial information about which countries are doing a better job than which other countries. But nonetheless, it is that kind of mindset for me, and I think for everyone, of looking at data and trends is keeps you mentally healthier than just consuming report after report of everything that's going wrong.
Absolutely. I think there's some good practical take-home advice for all of our viewers right there. I know I'm definitely guilty of spending too much time on Twitter, which doesn't exactly have an abundance of good news always. What of those data-driven points, maybe from Our World in Data or somewhere else, what is it that most gives you pause for thought, that think you may be wrong, on some of the, or at least to some extent wrong, or that these trends will start going downwards and backwards?
Well, most of the news regarding carbon emissions has not been particularly cheery. I mean, well, there's the side effect of the economic downturn from COVID has been that we've been burning less carbon, but that's obviously not sustainable. Although there are other graphs that are cause for not total gloom, namely the plunging cost of solar and wind power. Although the numbers from solar and wind don't add up to send us on a carbon-free trajectory anytime soon. The figures for democracy, even though I did mention they are higher in this decade than they have been in any other decade, but there's no question that over the course of the last decade, there's been a decline. And I think a number of the what we see, particularly in the United States, with the rise of authoritarian populism, of conspiracy theorizing, of a turn away from exactly the ideals of the Enlightenment that I've been challenging, namely science and data and policy, mean that the generators of progress are themselves threatened, which means we'll see if things start to turn around a bit tomorrow. But to the extent that ideals of the Enlightenment are repudiated, the drivers of progress aren't going to be there.
All of those points about authoritarianism and even carbon emissions and various other conspiracy problems, a lot of those things sound like they're very rife in the People's Republic of China at the moment. And obviously that is the place where the COVID-19 came from. I think you tweeted very recently that you're skeptical of this idea that that COVID-19 escaped from a lab by some kind of accident and that you've got a bet on it. But I wonder if you could talk about that specifically. But broadly, China, how enlightened it may be, is in how in touch with those Enlightenment values and what that may spell for the future of the world.
Yes, I do have, there's an organization called Long Bets where people can put skin in the game. And a number of years ago, Sir Martin Rees bet that there'd be an episode of bioterror or bioerror before 2020 that would have a million casualties. So I took him up on it several years ago. And we have agreed, even though the current state of evidence would have me as the winner, but neither of us is confident that we know the cause of the outbreak to settle the bet. And so we've put it off by at least 6 months until there's a real consensus. I think I'll win, but still, both of us want to be sure. So China is a complicated case. In one of the brainchildren of the Enlightenment, namely markets as a driver of economic growth and economic growth as a force of progress in kind of lifting up every other aspect of human well-being. Science have been wholeheartedly adopted by China, in contrast to, say, the preceding regime of Mao Zedong. On the other hand, notions of human rights and democracy and freedom of speech and inquiry, not so much. A question is, as China becomes more affluent, and of course sectors of China have been, but it's still a much poorer country than those of Western Europe or North America or other East Asian countries, will there be a pent-up demand for openness and rights? Will the stifling of free exchange of ideas pose a drag on what they clearly value, namely economic growth? And of course, China has been held as an alternative to the paradigm of liberal democracy and enlightenment in the West. It has helped itself, as I mentioned, to some of the Enlightenment values, but not others.
So if you were to take a long bet with me now, would you think that this century will be maybe the Chinese century based on all those sorts of metrics in the graphs you looked at? Or do you think those other kinds of pressures will really drag it right down, or until maybe there's some kind of democratic overthrow perhaps?
Well, economically, there's just no question that it'll be the world's largest economy. I mean, just if you compare it to the United States, it's got about 5 times the population. So as long as it's not 5 times as poor, as long as it doesn't have 1/5 of the affluence, just by the laws of arithmetic, it's going to be bigger. And I'm going to be amused by the panic in the United States over China overtaking it in terms of economic output. This is a good thing, unless you think it's a good thing for China to have 1/5 of the affluence of the United States forever. It's bound to overtake it, and likewise the European Union, with or without Britain. So unquestionably, it's going to be economically bigger, which means it's also going to be more powerful. By some measures, its citizens are going to live longer and healthier, just because that's what tends to happen in more affluent countries. In general, affluent countries tend to have all of the other good things. That is, statistically, they tend to be safer, they tend to be more gender equal, they tend to be more democratic, they tend to be more peaceful. But there are some conspicuous exceptions, such as the Arab oil states, which are filthy rich but repressive and in a number of ways backward. China will be an interesting case because it's going to get richer and richer, whether it will follow the trajectory of other liberal values going along or be another kind of conspicuous exception is, I guess I probably won't make a bet on that.
One last quick thing on China. Do you think that if the CCP stays in control in a way that many fear it might, do you think that it would try and actively go against other Enlightenment values in other states? It's being very aggressive towards, say, Hong Kong and breaking up the Sino-British Declaration there. It's been very aggressive towards Taiwan and India and Australia. Do you think it would get to such a point where it would actively seek to undo various other features of the Enlightenment so that it can exert more realpolitik control over the world?
Well, I mean, Hong Kong certainly, and tragically. Taiwan is it is a dangerous situation there. Australia and India less so, simply because it does not have real or nominal control over them. I don't think that either Australia or India will move in the direction of China. For still less developed countries in Africa, they'll accept aid from wherever it comes from, and and it's foreseeable that they could adopt more of say a China model than a Western Europe model. And going back to my bet with Lord Rees, it will be interesting if China's lack of openness is seen as working to its own disadvantage in not getting at to the bottom of the source of COVID, since it doesn't do anyone good not to have the potential to start pandemics and not know about it because you suppress embarrassing news. That's an example of how one of the built-in advantages of openness might and has in the past worked in its favor. Whether you can have a closed society indefinitely would be one of the great questions of the century.
Thank you. I do hope that all of our viewers have been cheered up, even in these sort of darkest of days. And in Britain, certainly, we're in the middle of another lockdown, by the very positive story there. I'd like to ask a little bit more about you personally. We talked just before we came on air about some of your specialities in things like linguistics. Why have you entered the fray in such a way? You feel a little like Cincinnatus putting down the plough and sort of returning to save Rome. Why not sort of spend your career as an academic without getting all the kind of council attempts and all those sorts of things that inspired you?
Well, one thing led to another, and an interest in language and more generally in human nature led to a further interest in where does human nature come from? And the answer to that is evolution, which has always been a contentious topic. And in particular, in my case, it led to since there have been accusations that anyone who believes in human nature must embrace a kind of reactionary politics. After all, you can't change human nature. Does that dash any hope for reform and social improvement? Does it mean we shouldn't strive for peace because war is in the genes and man is just a man the killer? And I pushed back against that by noting not only does human nature comprise a number of conflicting tendencies. I think we do have instincts toward vengeance and dominance, but we also have empathy and self-control and moral norms and problem-solving capacity. But even an analysis of human nature is moot when you look at historical data. And if the data are telling us that rates of violence have declined, then it becomes, as they say, a philosophical question of whether we're doomed to perpetual strife and oppression. The data say that we're not. So that was the trajectory that led me to the surprisingly controversial claim that there has been progress. And of course, any discussion of human nature bumps into politicized questions like, are men and women indistinguishable? Are individuals interchangeable in terms of their genetic endowment? And that does take you into various minefields, or took me into those minefields.
Could you talk a little bit about that? I think you talked this last summer about a sort of cancellation attempt made against you. And it's obviously quite a fraught issue across university campuses. It is at Oxford. And it goes into this wider debate about free speech. What do you think about that, the debate that's been raging recently? And is it the sort of very brittle discussion that we're having these days about it? Because it always descends into whether Parler should be banned or whether Twitter should get rid of Donald Trump, and more generally, the state of academic free speech and free speech more broadly.
Yeah, I think it's a discussion that we need to have with a fair amount of subtlety, that is dividing issues from each other that are easy to glom together. So, for example, the platform available to the President of the United States, I think, is a sui generis issue, and you can't generalize from whether Donald Trump can keep his Twitter account to other free speech issues, especially when he uses that account to issue bellicose statements about nuclear war. So let's put aside the issues about the President of the United States. There are also issues about legitimate government control over speech, where very wide latitude, I think, ought to be available. And here I'm strongly within the American tradition of broad latitude for speech outside of government coercion, the American First Amendment. When it comes to universities, it isn't, and to mainstream publishing outlets, both book publishers and news outlets, the issue isn't should everyone get a platform, because obviously no one ever has. There have to be measures of quality control and discernment. Not every kook gets an op-ed in The Guardian or a tenured position at the University of Oxford. The problem with a lot of cancel culture is that legitimate scholarly inquiry, meeting standards of peer-reviewed science and scholarship, gets quashed because of the content of the conclusions. That is, that there is an orthodoxy on a number of politicized issues where unpopular but opinions that have met standards of quality get squashed. That's bound to lead both to a distortion of our understanding of reality, and it opens the door to demagogues who can then claim that they too are victims of cancel culture, as we've seen in the United States, where the cancellation of a book by a rather irresponsible politician, Josh Hawley, he turned it around and blamed that on cancel culture. Preposterous in his case, but the universities opened the door for him to walk through. And it also, I think, saps the credibility of the entire establishment of responsible truth-seeking and fact-finding. That if it is widely believed that dissenting opinions will not be tolerated, that anyone who goes against the mainstream will be canceled, fired, suppressed, then people think, why should I trust the consensus of scientists? You tell me that 99% of scientists accept human-made climate change? Yeah, but from what I've read about universities, if anyone didn't, they'd be canceled. So why should I believe the scientific consensus? That's the kind of, I think, dreadful risk that it's not a risk, it's a reality, price that is being paid for the unfortunately often valid impression that universities are not crucibles for open exchange of ideas.
And so you have knowledge as one of those features in your presentation, and this does seem, this growth of cancel culture, like it could be a block on that kind of progress. I'm not normally one to quote Lenin, but I think Lenin asked the question, what is to be done? So what is to be done in countering this?
Yeah, so I think part of the pushback has to come from people in positions of power and responsibility. And one of the shocking features of cancel culture is how quickly university provosts and vice chancellors and presidents have acceded to quite preposterous demands for intellectual conformity, coming from sometimes from students and academics. And I would like to see a little more backbone and commitment to principle from the people who actually wield the levers of power. But it also at the grassroots level, one of the great hazards of punishment of dissenting ideas is that we know from sociological modeling that can lead to something called pluralistic ignorance, where everyone believes that everyone else believes something, but most people don't believe it. But that kind of denial, that emperor's new clothes phenomenon, can occur when there is punishment. When you get punished for, if you have legitimate fear you're going to be punished for an unorthodox opinion, and you fear that you're going to be punished for failing to punish. If you don't denounce someone for being a racist, that shows that you're a racist. That can lead to the entrenchment of pluralistic ignorance, where there are a percentage of people who are fanatical true believers, then there can be a much larger people who've been intimidated into silence. And so to break that spiral of silence, to have the little boy saying the emperor is naked, we have to also empower the people, the students, the younger people, who perhaps aren't going along with this repression, but are just afraid to open their mouths. So they have to be given a platform as well.
Speaking of giving students a platform, we're going to turn in just a second to the many wonderful questions that our members are sending in. The last question from me that I'm going to be asking everybody this term: what's the one thing, and it can be a really niche concern, niche issue, that we should be paying lots of attention to, but we aren't?
Well, let's see, where do I begin? Small modular nuclear reactors, or fourth generation nuclear. The world is ravenous for energy. It's probably not all going to come from solar and wind, especially in developing countries, which should and ought to be allowed to grow economically. You can't grow economically without plentiful energy. A new generation of nuclear energy that does not have the expense and regulatory burden of massive light water reactors is at least one place to look.
And that's another very positive answer. I'm going to turn to some questions now and hope that maybe in these questions there's somewhere that I can tempt you into a long bet with me.
Okay. By the way, how are we doing with the microphone issues? I just noticed.
Oh, yeah, you sound great now. Thank you.
Okay.
The first question I've got here is from Jessica Swafford from Jesus College, who says, I noticed in your happiness graph, there was a decline in the US, which you mentioned, around 2010, 2014. This is around the same time that smartphones became mainstream. Do you think immediate access to seeing what others are doing all of the time has contributed to this dip?
There is such an argument that the constant social comparison of the fear of missing out, everyone seems to be happy but me, plus the channels for sniping malicious gossip, especially I think for younger people who don't have the experience and emotional maturity to ride out the nastiness, could be a factor. Although in the case of the United States, there has been a slight decline that began even before that time. So I think that could be a contributor. But there is something in that and many ways, where the United States is a very weird country by the standards of affluent democracies. And the United States has been getting less happy even before the introduction of smartphones, though it's conceivable that that contributed.
Thank you. We've got a question from Manuel Fieber here, who says, well, thank you for sharing your observations. And you can clearly follow your argument of reason and science having an effect on our ability to combat pandemics. But another important aspect of enlightenment, namely humanism, can be under a lot of threat given social distancing and increasing isolation. What are your reflections on that?
Yeah, a good question, and hopefully the experiment will be over soon enough that it won't leave that even if it did have an effect, it would be reversed quickly enough. Although in general, while there's no substitute for face-to-face contact entirely, it is remarkable how much as a species we thrive on information. That what we're doing right now, the video conferencing and video chatting, has filled us an astonishing proportion, not 100%, but an enormous amount of human interaction. And prior to that, of course, there were long distance relationships, there were epistolary relationships. It's rather surprising how far humans can get by the written and spoken word, to say nothing of video feeds. Not the same, but in fact, in probing how the humanism originated and people have second thoughts about burning heretics alive and breaking people on the wheel, there is a theory that beginning in the 18th century, the printing press and the widespread distribution of novels got people into the habit of inhabiting other people's skin and seeing the world from their point of view, that made it a little harder to be sadistic and callous. And that was all through the written word alone. That's a hypothesis from Lynn Hunt, from Martha Nussbaum and others. I discussed it in The Better Angels of Our Nature, and I think there is some evidence for it. But we're, as once been put, we are informavores. We devour information, and not all the way, but a large part of the way we can go by these other channels. Thank you.
There's an anonymous attendee has asked something that I think it relates to this idea of increased empathy and ways we can get around that. How should we, given everything that's happened in the past year, tackle the problem of racism in our societies?
Well, there has been, of course, very conspicuous efforts to root out racism in all of its forms. And a little known fact, and this ties into the earlier themes, is that racism has been declining. Again, this may sound incredible on the face of it, but in surveys, both of overt racism, at least in the United States, I don't know about data from Britain, but if you ask people questions like, do you think that Black and white children should go to school together? Would you move out if a Black family moved in next door? Do you think that Blacks are lazier than whites? Would you be upset if your child married a person of another race? The rates of racist responses have plummeted, and in some cases they are kind of bouncing around the floor at the level of crank opinion. And there's a phenomenon over the last 60 or 70 years. Now you might say, well, that might just be an artifact of social desirability. People know that these aren't things that you admit to in polite company, but they're as racist as ever. But at least two measures of more covert, subtle racism have also shown decline. I did an admittedly crude analysis in Enlightenment Now of searches for racist jokes, where people, you can get those data from Google. And these are things that people do in the privacy of their homes. There's no social desirability basis. And those searches have declined. People don't find racist and sexist and homophobic jokes as funny as they used to. And my colleagues Tessa Charlesworth and Mahzarin Banaji being famous for her implicit association test, the most widely used test of implicit bias, that is not asking people questions about other races, but looking to see how they strongly they associate white faces with positive adjectives and black faces with negative adjectives. She's been doing that research for 20 years, and she and Tessa Charlesworth have found that measures of implicit unconscious bias have been declining as well. So we've been doing something right. We have seen in the last few years some of the overt racists crawling out from under the rocks, possibly because of social media. But even during the Trump years, the progress against racism continued. One can hope that there will be a backlash against the overt forms of racism that have been given a voice, and at some of the measures that are called systemic racism, I think somewhat misleadingly, because they may be residues of past discrimination and oppression, but that obviously ought to be eliminated as well. I'll just throw in a couple of other measures of progress that, although there is still a black-white gap in the United States, which ought to be reduced, both all of the gaps, health, income, literacy, and happiness, have shrunk over the last 60 years or so.
I'm finding all this very encouraging. Thank you. We've got a question from George Turner, 2 questions actually, in saying thank you for your talk and the questions so far. What your thoughts are on sort of postmodernism and its sort of skepticism of things like science and reason, and linked to that, why is it that some people will accept sort of with only a priori judgments about scientifically backed claims about climate change, but then not at the same time all the evidence that, say, free markets lead to greater wealth and progress as well?
Yes, an apt question. So postmodernism both is incoherent, because any claim that truth is relative or socially constructed or is itself advanced as if it was objectively true for everyone, and so by its own standards is contradictory. Namely, if someone says everything is a social construction and has no inherent merit, you can always say, well, does that claim have any inherent merit? If not, I don't have to believe it. If it does, you just contradicted yourself. This is a theme that I work out in my forthcoming book on rationality. But also, relativists, social constructionists, postmodernists, and so on don't have the courage of their convictions in 2 regards. One of them is that they, of course, avail themselves of the gifts of modern medicine and indeed of modern economies. They'll use antibiotics, and most of them probably will get vaccinated. And when it comes to the kind of atrocities and crimes that energize the moral momentum behind postmodernism, namely that there is deplorable inequality and oppression and dangerous human-made climate change, well, unless you believe that those are just narratives, then you've got to be committed to objective truth and science as the means of demonstrating it. Is carbon dioxide a social construction? Is climate change just another narrative? If you say, well, no, they're really real and we've got to take steps against them, you've signed on to the whole agenda of science as a means of determining objective truth. As for the benefits of free market economies, on the one hand, yes, I think it is something that intellectuals are apt to deny in the face of evidence that it is markets that make people affluent, and many good things come from affluence, including in China and India. On the other hand, the data also tell us that markets by themselves have no mechanism for providing for those who have nothing to offer in the marketplace, such as children, such as the elderly, such as the sick, such as the poor, and that 100% of affluent countries have an extensive social safety net and redistribution, as I showed in the graph from the OECD earlier in the talk. So looking at what works in the world as our indicator of what political system we ought to praise, yes, markets, but also yes, social spending and regulation. Unless you're proposing some theoretical, idealistic, utopian entity that has never existed, namely an affluent market society with no social spending, then you have to, looking at the data, acknowledge that that's simply what a free market economy is. Namely, it has regulation and social spending in addition.
Thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'll go on to some very easy, light touch questions, i.e. God. Lots of questions in here about the role that religion has played, perhaps because the Enlightenment came around out of Europe. Does Christianity have any kind of particular role that it can play, that it's helped in these sorts of areas? Or even another question here linked to it, that because the enormity of the universe and the unlikelihood of us getting these kinds of progress and things existing at all, are there any merits for the arguments around the existence of God?
Yes. Well, I'll start with the last first. No, I don't think there are any there's any merit for arguments for the existence of God. And classic objections are, why is there COVID? Why did the Holocaust take place? Why did God allow slavery to happen? And cancer and childhood starvation and all the rest. In terms of contributions of religion, it would be a mistake to say that there have been none. I mean, religion is a very large category. There have been some excellent ideas, such as Christianity's disparagement of revenge, vendetta, the code of blood revenge, which was the way of most traditional societies were organized. And so when Jesus said there are alternatives, that was a pretty big idea. Religious institutions, to the extent that they support charities and hospitals and give people a place to meet and work with other people, are good things, which is separate from the content of religious beliefs. And certainly, together with whatever beneficial effects have come out of religious institutions, there are, of course, also crusades and fatwas and inquisitions and wars of religion continuing to take place in the Middle East. So overall, I think that the positive contributions of religion can be and are being taken over by humanistic institutions like hospitals and charities and liberal democracies. The moral content is simply the secular moral philosophy of the Enlightenment, of utilitarianism, deontological theories that don't need scripture or commandments to give us reasons why it's not a good thing to rape and kill and exploit each other.
Thank you. Now, our last minute, I found one last question here that may be where I get my long bet with you. What's your view on Brexit? I know it's a parochial question, but... Yes,
talk about a minefield. I thought it was a bad idea. If for no other reason than the Northern Ireland Irish Republic border, but also keeping Scotland within the United Kingdom, and just the overall momentum toward international cooperation, which I think is a good thing, despite the unquestionable irrationalities in the EU. But personally, I think it would have been better to try to push back against what's wrong with the EU than just to bail out altogether. I hope I haven't made enemies, but maybe I've made friends among the membership here.
Professor Pinker, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to all of the questions that have come in. Hopefully people will be leaving with a spring in their step, knowing that progress is real and that there's some development to be had there and some greater wonders and joy in the world. For everyone who was lucky enough to make it into the ballot, we'll see you in the other Zoom chat that you've had a link for. And with that, Professor Pinker, thank you very much indeed.